The RFNG is supported in part by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Our people are the rights holders. When citizens share a vision, participate in decisions, and receive meaningful information, our path from the Indian Act to inherent right self-government becomes real. Adapted from the 5 pillars of the Centre for First Nations Governance. Hello, and welcome to Inherent Rights Informed Voices, a podcast brought to you by the Centre for First Nations Governance and the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project. Today, we're discussing the importance of engaging our communities in the work of developing self-government. So, how do we actually encourage engagement? My name is Chris Robertson, and I'll be your host for today. I was the Chief Operating Officer of the Centre for First Nations Governance predecessor, the National Centre for First Nations Governance, and I am currently an advisor at the organization while sitting on the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Steering Committee. The heart of CFNG and RFNG is community. It's a project built on the importance of engaging our citizens to create their own systems of governance and bring legitimacy into the 3 orders of governing systems in Canada on a nation-to-nation-to-nation relationship. In our episode today, Pawa and Sonia will teach us more about the process.
Citizen engagement for me is so important because I see it as an opportunity for our people to get back to our traditional ways of love and unity. It's a way to uplift and honor our voices for decision making. Sonia
Leo is a proud member of the Lil'wat Nation and has spent over a decade working with and for Indigenous communities and organizations in the pursuit of cultural sustainability and self-determination. Sonia led a literature review on innovations in citizen engagement, a literature review and best practices analysis. So how are you doing, Sonia?
I'm good. It's nice to see you. I just want to start off. I'm not speaking for First Nations people. I'm not speaking for my community. I'm not speaking for anybody. And this isn't to, speak on anyone's behalf except for my lived experience when it comes to this.
Yeah, this is really just sort of based on your own experience and your own observations. And really, you're just sharing your knowledge. Given that, let's leap straight into the questions. From your time working with First Nations, can you reflect on the importance of citizen engagement in self-governance work, and how have you seen that play out?
Yeah, so for me, when it comes to citizen engagement, it almost sounds like a term that doesn't even need like a term in community because we're always engaging with each other, it's just the way we're always helping each other, and we've done that for eons, for thousands of years. We're always engaging. Every person had their role in the community, right? Everyone did what they were supposed to do. And it wasn't even like work. It was just their role and their responsibilities, and it was their being based on values that contributed to the collective, right? And so it's very interesting to try to just say, okay, citizen engagement, what is it? Well, it's everything. And it's how I believe our people have survived, We've always had this history of interacting with each other. We've always had this history of engaging with each other in ceremonies and in our whole lives, right? And so I think if we're looking at it like historically, we've always had it, But then now today, it's getting branded as this like, okay, how do we engage with our citizens? But meanwhile, I think the most important question is like, okay, remember or acknowledge why that doesn't exist like it did before colonization. How was it disrupted, right? And always name that, because I feel like it's so easy to say, okay, why aren't the citizens engaged? But it's like, wait a minute, let's understand and respect why they were denied the right to have their voices heard, why they couldn't participate in decision-making matters. For example, my grandfather's generation, why were they denied the rights to practice their customs, their cultural practices and traditions until very recently in my eyes, right? And so for me, citizen engagement is just remembering who we were before colonization and colonial policies that prevented us from engaging, recognizing that, and then rebuilding that trust, so we can come together as a community instead of, saying, oh, what's wrong with the people? Why aren't they getting together? The way I see citizen engagement or community engagement is giving everybody a voice, just empowering the people that their vision and voice is worthy, and empowering the people and reminding them everyone has a vision, everyone has a voice they can use if they want, and then lift them up. And if they're not there yet, again, meet them where they are. And I do believe that everyone has this, vision for what they want for their community, and citizen engagement is one way for everybody's dreams to be shared and then come together, and then good work can unfold from that. And not pressuring people like, oh, it's year end, you got to do this, we got to meet now, we got to, it's like, wait, let's take time to build the trust needed, to build these relationships. So it's not transactional, so it's not exploiting people. And it's not like, I want your voice so I can do this. It's really like, what do you have to say? And then honoring it.
Yeah, I think you've hit a very good point there. It's almost like rebuilding connection. That, through everything that has happened, there was disconnection, massive disconnection between, children and families, within families, those on reserve, off reserve. All these systems of disconnection have sort of contributed to this, I guess, lack of so-called engagement, when it's really the effort should be is, how do we bring back reconnecting ourselves among each other, creating a foundation to move governance forward. The connection has to come from within the community first and among ourselves. I like the angle that you're coming from on this. It makes so much sense. No, I really like this. We're visiting this whole notion of traditional engagement. And there's also these tools and models out there, these contemporary models. Is there a way to be able to mix that, to use the two of them together as opposed to separately, in order to capture what we're talking about, having meaningful conversation?
Yeah, I think absolutely. But first and foremost, just based on the research I did and from my own experience and knowledge about, the world that the AI or, the IT world is, it's all for us, if we're talking about Indigenous or First Nations community grounded community engagement, it's the way I see it, number one, get grounded in the traditional engagement models, right? First and foremost, and then use the contemporary models as an add-on, right? Not a replacement, more to enhance, because when we think about it, it's so easy to take that, the contemporary and try to cookie cutter and replace it. But the traditions are there for a reason, right? They're, the way I see it, to be respected, to be honored. And so if we do that and use the contemporary models to enhance it, then I think it could be great. But I think that number one, there are security issues, right? That we have to protect community data, and there has to be data sovereignty, right? The people, just as without even the digital world, the peoples have to be protected. It has to be community controlled. And if we're relying on technology too much, then the community loses that control because they're relying on technology, right? So before we gave it up through colonization, or we didn't give it up, it was lost through colonization. But do we also want to, don't we want to protect it from the digital world as well, right? So if things are too reliant on the digital world, I think there's a risk, only because we're still in the new phase of this era, right? On how to protect the people and their data, stuff like that. But I definitely think that there is a way to combine it, especially like, for example, what we're doing now, right? We're online, you're over there, I'm over here, and we're able to connect. And also for on reserve or off reserve members, right? If there's something that wants to, an important meeting that has to be had, or there's people with limitations, health limitations, or just any kind of transport barriers, technology is could be a great tool to connect everybody, you know, into a meeting if they don't have technology barriers, because could be an issue too. Some people don't have access to Wi-Fi, or they don't have access to this technology that we have. You know, for us, it could be considered a luxury compared to some, right? So in some ways, it would be great for those who have, but those who haven't, it's creating another barrier to participation. So it's almost like the two truths can exist, right, at the same time. But then also the whole thing with going online and using online tools is that there could be cyberbullying. And so I know from my experience, we do have a community page on Facebook, and that seems to be the band office's way to get messages out. But then at the end of the day, there can be lateral violence online, right? Or there can be people who are feeling a certain way online and they're expressing it, you know, that they wouldn't say face to face. So it's kind of, I think when we're talking about technology, you have to put in safety measures, you know, and maybe monitoring to make sure that there is none of that extra lateral violence, and that the people and their knowledge are protected and not just signed away just because it's available.
Great segue into question number 5, which was, what obstacles do you see there being to community engagement, and how can we work with them? You know, you've made a very good point, because in some communities, all they do is they just post it on either the Facebook site or the website. That's the only thing they do. A very important issue. And in some of the communities that I've worked in, I've seen people go, you know, that's not good enough. I'm going to print this out at home. I'm going to make 50 copies, and I'm going door to door, and I'm going to have conversations. So that, to me, is exactly what you're talking about, is, you know, the traditional way of face-to-face, taking this right out there, going up, having conversations, yet also using technology. But that has its massive limitations in terms of people becoming too dependent on it, or really almost doing it in a way to skirt accountability. They can always claim that, you know, we've had it out there for months, but it has such limited access through just using that technology in isolation. You know, so yeah, no, you've hit it bang on. Leadership is still a critical part of ensuring the success of community engagement, or even getting these things off the ground. How do we get them out? And how do we keep them engaged with their own communities? I've often found that you know, they may be the ones that want these things to happen. We get out there in community, they're the ones that don't show up. And I'm not just talking about elected leadership. I'm talking about, you know, community leaderships, youth leadership in the administration, where they should be, at least in my mind, having those conversations with the people and contributing to the community's level of awareness. And so often as outsiders, when we as CFNG go in, we need to, you know, that's the source of there's a lot of knowledge that needs to come out from them that ends up being absent. And it's always been a struggle, I think, for us. What is the compelling argument that we provide to pull them in kicking and screaming to these sessions, which I understand a lot of them don't show up because they fear conflict. As you well know, the sessions that we do are very safe sessions, and because we really advocate for dialogue and communication among people, we generally don't face that conflict. I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about what we do. How do we reach that group of people?
What's coming to mind is just being truthful and open and almost promote it in the way, where we can, about naming it. Like, we acknowledge people choose not to engage, right? And it's sometimes only the same 10 people keep showing up, and name it and just be like, hey, we understand this is what's going on. We're going to have this session. We know that this might happen. But then at the same time, like I mentioned at the beginning, acknowledge the colonial dynamics that are ongoing and the impact of the Indian Act that continues to undermine Indigenous governance structures, and name that and say, this is still happening. As long as the band office is there and there is power dynamics, at least naming it. So we can say, and maybe by naming it, people will be like, you know what? I don't want to participate in this way. I want to be engaged, right? And so I think that could help, right? And just remember that for effective and legitimate engagement, we want to just be able to show we really are in this together, and it's about, how this isn't transactional. And I could imagine leadership doesn't want to engage because of their jobs. And one thing to acknowledge too is that there is community engagement fatigue. When you think about any kind of person working in community, they get invitations day and night from all levels of government, from utilities, from, at the neighboring communities, non-Indigenous. They get pulled onto committees. They get pulled at family, school, all of these levels. They're pulled in different ways for more meetings, more these kinds of things. So just also acknowledging that and saying, listen, you're busy there. We understand that. But just know your voice is important here. We want to hear it, and you can inspire people. And then just making the place, comfortable enough where it's like, we need you, we want you, please come be with us, kind of thing, right? And getting away from that transactional approach where this is what we want to engage on. What can we get out of this, And I think there's definitely a way for leadership to realize, even though they might have their role in the community, that is something else than how their voice could be shared in community engagement, right? It's kind of like adding that, I think recognizing people do get burnt out and they have their limits, but then maybe trying to plan around that and just being like, be like, please, we need you, kind of thing, right? And naming it, and just highlighting or celebrating the value, and because I feel like it can be so, we have our head down, we're doing the work, and it could feel like we're not getting anywhere, so what's the point? But I think that's why it's a good idea maybe to have a community engagement almost champion to advocate for the work and be like, yes, this is important, let's not give up. Almost a hopeful spirit, and that could come maybe from the youth, maybe from an adult, maybe an elder, but someone positioned to be like, hey, a respectful person, not using them, but having them be the person to kind of bring the people together.
Yeah, it's almost like the community getting up and hosting itself, as its own entity, conversation circles. It deals with the priorities that are the communities to own, as opposed to, and I loved your analysis of so many outside movements that are taxing our people's time, and effort, and being engaged out. Well, I've enjoyed this conversation. You have a lot of spirit behind this.
Always nice talking with you too.
Through community-led analysis on the impact of Indian Act governance, the RFNG project helps to develop new forms of governance structures based on a community's unique needs.
The inherent right to self-governance is a collective right, and so having the voice of the people expressed in that's the role that citizen engagement plays.
Pawa Haiyupis is a member of the Hausut First Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island. She has facilitated engagement in First Nations communities for over 25 years, focusing on inherent rights governance, youth leadership, and strategic visioning and planning. Pawa was a research assistant for the RFNG project. Good morning. How are you doing, Pawa?
I'm doing good.
So, from your times working in First Nations, can you reflect on the importance of the need for and the importance of citizen engagement in self-government work, and how you've seen it play out in your experiences?
Yeah, for sure. Well, especially with the inherent right to self-governance, it's a collective right that's held by the people. And so that's why citizen engagement is so important when we're talking about that, and trying to reestablish those traditional pre-contact governance systems that we once had. We need to tap into the collective wisdom of the people, the citizens' knowledge, so that they're the ones really guiding that process. And so engaging the citizens and the people in self-governance helps us achieve like a co-created mandate or vision that can then guide their decisions, where their community, where their nation is going. And I remember hearing Chief Sophie Pierre from Danaha talking, this is many moons ago, talking about how they engaged their people to get that clear vision. But it really helped them going forward because they knew what the people wanted. And so if these opportunities came that didn't align with what the people wanted, they can confidently say no. Also, with engaging, why citizen engagement is so important for leadership is that there will be less resistance when they go and when they want to start moving their governance forward, or these decisions are being made. If it involves the people, they're going to flow with it. They're going to show up and help you accomplish that. If you, on the other hand, are off camera in a room making decisions, not updating your people, not letting them know what the leadership is deciding and the future of the nation, then that's when the resistance of the people starts to come in. They want to, and they should be, because nation building takes all of us. We all have to show up and pitch in to get that machinery working and to start moving forward all together. It can't just be a handful of people doing that for thousands.
Exactly. It underscores accountability too with leadership, knowing that they're sitting on specific information that citizens have provided to them in terms of what they want and what they don't want. So leadership should actually feel quite emboldened when they walk into things like, negotiations, that they have a very clear mandate in terms of what to represent and what they can't represent. That being said, can you define community engagement? What does really effective engagement look like to you?
As I've grown as a facilitator in this line of work, we're decolonizing, we're rebuilding our nations, we're trying to indigenize our governance. It's really important to start any engagement from a place of wellness. That could be, a question that's asking about, what are you grateful for? It could be an opening prayer, or maybe even a bit of culture, bringing in some culture, some song or dance. But, to be grounded and rooted in a place of wellness before we dive into topics like the Indian Act, that's really important. And then also to finish from that similar wellness place. I also believe trying to be as inclusive as possible. Just wanting to make sure that everybody feels that they can participate. And that might mean reducing some of the barriers to engagement, like having childcare. Or I've been to some communities, in Saskatchewan, for example, where the community is so large, the houses are so far apart, sometimes transportation is a barrier. So even having, a vehicle just drive around and pick people up to bring them and drop them home. So that's also important, as well as nourishing food, practices that help us take care of our spirit. But in terms of like community engagement, driving decisions, I think the more that we can have it participatory, so like engaging the citizens, the people, the participants who are showing up in those conversations, and just as a facilitator, I often say I'm the kind of facilitator. I want everything out of your brain on sticky notes or posters, flip charts, so that's my style. But it's also important for, like, I work with people who bring an element of fun. Unfortunately, that's not me, but I enjoy working with people who, will have the fun. Again, with Lake Bubby Nation, they would have door prizes, which is also a really great way to increase engagement. And in this kind of economy we have, a cash door prize seems to be a hit. But they would do fun things like play bingo with their language, or have the duck races. So, just like really bringing an element of fun and getting everybody involved that way as well. When we're talking about nation building and inherent right to self-governance, it's really, again, that collective right. And it takes that unified voice to propel it forward.
Agreed. And I think what a lot of people tend to forget is that because Aboriginal and treaty rights and title are held collectively anyway, my sense is there's a higher degree of responsibility and activity required to get to harvest that collective input than most people understand. We often are subjected to, why can't you guys just make a decision? Well, that's the difference between the Western world and the Indigenous world, is that we have a greater responsibility to go out and collect that input because of the nature of rights and title held in the value of it being collective, whereby in the outside world, you just elect somebody, and right there, as a result of doing that, they have a mandate to really do whatever they want because they got all these votes, maybe not specifically on a certain issue, but generally they can go out and make those decisions. For our leadership, there's a much higher degree of responsibility that's required for them to collect that information and adequately represent it.
And that ongoing collection and harvesting of that information is our ongoing oral history. Like, the oral history didn't stop at contact. Like, the story is still ongoing. And so I believe that, the harvesting of those conversations, or if there's recordings or like video recordings or audio, that those will become useful for future, people to be able to look back on and hear maybe it's even a relative, but the person from their nation, the knowledge holder, sharing that, and so that becomes gems of and a wealth of knowledge.
And that's a good segue into the next question, which is, with so many digital and technological innovations out there in our world today, how can these new digital and technological advancements impact, our public participation?
I think that when there's a call for public participation, being able to have an online event, a webinar, some sort of teach, or something that's interactive, it becomes easier to increase engagement, in terms of it saves travel, right? So if we find the right time, which in Canada is around after 10 a.m. Pacific time, but to 2 p.m. Pacific time, because that's what is that? 5 or 6 in the Atlantic. So, there's a short window, but the reach would be to have more people across Canada be able to participate in an online event. There's lots of tools, I guess, in terms of, being able to use, they used to have jam boards, but now it seems like Canva boards, just for, again, that kind of getting people's thoughts or ideas in.
You highlighted some areas there in terms of ways about how we could use some of that technology in the work of community engagement. Are there any other ways to mix traditional engagement models with contemporary engagement models? I mean, we've had some of that in the past, and you triggered one of the memories, which was during COVID, having to do this all online, and even having firekeepers involved. And I believe you were part of that 3-4 day session that we did with one of the First Nations back in Ontario. And notwithstanding the time difference, we pulled it off. That to me was a prime example of incorporating two very unusual ways that at first wouldn't even seem complementary, but man, it really blended extremely well. Are there other ways of doing that?
I would be really excited to explore that, because we were able, again, that capacity to engage people across the country, across time zones. And we had over 45 people show up. It was a long weekend. It was Thanksgiving weekend. And for 3 days, we had 45 people returning each day. So I would love to continue to explore that. I have seen sometimes people will send a package. So maybe there's teas or medicines in the package. So it's sent before the event, and then during the event, they can pull out their sage and also smudge themselves while the elder is doing it, or maybe it has a candle, or you could drink tea and one of our Indigenous medicine teas, and maybe hear a story or have a visual of going to pick the Labrador tea or whatever kind of tea it is. So it's really inspirational to see how people are weaving those two worlds together, online and with the use of technology. And I also have a father who's a traditional medicine person, so I think it could go too far when on TikTok and you're starting to talk about sacred knowledge to everyone. Some knowledge keepers, such as my father, would not agree with that way of sharing teachings. It's more, there's more of a sacredness to that. But I think that we could still find where is that line, and how do we how do we play within that line without causing harm to our sacred teachings, because there's some things still need to be kept sacred.
Absolutely. Yeah, very, very good point. What are some of the obstacles to community engagement that you've come across, and how can we work through those particular obstacles?
There's one of the first things that comes to mind is the poverty and houselessness. But we did an engagement in Vancouver, and there was some unhoused that showed up. I didn't even know they were unhoused because they were fully participating. It was so important to them. And it was just on the last day that I found out that they were living in a shelter. And so being able to have, sometimes we have to meet in cities in hotels, but it's nice if we could find a hotel that would allow us to have takeaway containers, so that if there's extra food, that it's not just going to be thrown out. It can go to feed our people. I think I also mentioned, cash door prizes earlier. That's also a great way to increase engagement, just to get people to not only show up, but to stay till the end of the day. Or, if you disperse it a couple of times throughout the day. Another obstacle for community engagement is childcare. So providing a safe childcare place so that parents can also show up. Or, often we have babies and toddlers in our community sessions, and it's that sense of, we love that. Another obstacle is just being trauma sensitive. So including land-based activities or weaving in culture can help the participants connect to spirit. And open space technology is a great way, as we talked about earlier, that where participants make their own agenda and host the conversations that matter most to them. So those are some ways to, a few obstacles and a couple of ways to possibly overcome them.
One of the obstacles that I've seen emerge out there has been, and I know that one of the principles around open space is whoever comes are the right people. And in many cases, I've seen that's true to a point, but we also need effective leadership being there. And how do we overcome that? What do we do in order to encourage the leadership to come out? And I'm not talking just, elected leadership. I'm talking all leadership, that really should be part of that, because that's an opportunity for them to pass on knowledge to the community. We all know those gaps in communication that exist in communities, even the communication gaps that emerge prior to us going in, where a lot of the community don't even know that we're there, and the community is still struggling. And, how often have you heard, we didn't hear about this, or we've been sending notices out to the community for the last month and a half and nobody shows up. Those are obstacles in themselves. How do we deal with that?
Good question. Yeah, in terms of having leaders show up, I think I do believe it's really key that they're a part of not only listening to what the people are saying, but to share to share when it's appropriate, or maybe even call their own open space conversation to talk about something that's really important to them. I think it is a really great venue to do that. I know that often with leadership and executives, they are more wanting the 30-minute, because they're so busy, their schedules are so full. So that if it's that's going to take a half a day, they're kind of can you do that in 30 minutes? I often get that request. And so maybe it's being very intentional with the agenda and then inviting them, at this part of the agenda would be really great if you could come and be a part of the conversations, or building them in, or maybe even inviting them to host an open space if there's something that they want to talk about or share about or get input on. It is such an important thing to involve and include the leaders, because that's often, if they're able to make the decisions right there in the room, that's such a valuable thing. It's just the timing of when is it good for them to show up.
And I like that, Pawa, because really what you're doing too is you're giving leadership the opportunity to propose their own agenda item on matters that matter to them. And quite often that can be how they as individuals to learn about engaging the community and even gauging the responses of the community to them. And that's why I think that particularly the open space process is that opportunity. And we can even throw that out to them that, look, you may not be available for day 1 or day 2, but guess what? Here's a perfect opportunity for you on day 3.
And also there's the butterflies and bumblebees who may also eventually come over, so if you do hold that space and nobody's there in the first 5 minutes, still hold that space, do your reflections, people may come and start joining in.
And thanks, Pawa, for joining us today and taking the time out from your schedule to illuminate us on other approaches.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to Sonia Leo and Pawa Haiyupis for sharing their informed voices. We hope you join us next time on Inherent Rights, Informed Voices, Reclaiming Our Rights and Ourselves. Next episode, don't miss out as Dr. Mason Ducharme hosts a roundtable with some of the RFNG project's community partners.
Our season finale is fast approaching. If you want to ask a question and have it answered on air with Catherine MacQuarrie, make sure to email iriv.rfng@gmail.com. That's iriv.rfng@gmail.com, so your voice is heard.